Hello everyone and welcome. The big question for today is, can your coffee be too fresh? In order to answer this, we're going to look at a few different things. First, we need to understand what happens when coffee is roasted and why the freshest possible roast may not be ideal for coffee brewing. Second, we need to know what happens to coffee over time, and we will take a look at when we think coffee is at its best age for optimal quality. But just before I jump right into it, please take a moment to like this video and consider subscribing. Each and every one of you is a key part in helping me grow this channel, and I really can't do it without you. Okay, so fresh coffee. What do we need to know? Well, during the roasting process, we are taking a green bean and applying a large amount of heat to it over an extended period of time. We roast this bean, and during this time, there are a lot of chemical reactions occurring. One of our key interests for this question of freshness is that carbon dioxide, or CO2, is building up inside the cells of our roasted coffee as the bean expands and becomes more porous during roasting. Also inside the cells are our flavor and aromatic compounds. These are the things that we want to dissolve into our water and get into our cup. So how do these two parts interact? Well, when we try to brew our coffee and we add water to it, we are encouraging the water to go inside the cells, dissolve whatever's in there, and come back out. But when there are large amounts of CO2 still present inside the cells, two things happen. First, the water has a harder time extracting our flavors as the CO2 blocks the way. And second, some CO2 does dissolve into the water and go into our cup, which adds a negative and undesirable bitter flavor. So what's the point here? Well, the closer the beans are to their roast state, the more CO2 they have, because carbon dioxide slowly leaves the beans over time. With this in mind, you can kind of begin to see why coffee may not be at its best when it's super fresh. If the CO2 is getting in the way of our extraction or adding negative bitter flavors, then we should actually be waiting for a reasonable amount of it to leave the beans before it will taste its best. Now, there can be some debate here at this point, but the general consensus is that the coffee has reached its peak flavor around 2 to 3 weeks after roasting. As long as it has remained in its whole bean form and has been stored in the right conditions, this is the approximate time that we would estimate the coffee has released enough of its CO2 to give its full flavor potential. Although it should be noted that the time frame may be shorter for darker roasts, as the darker we go, the more porous the beans are, and the quicker they give off their CO2. But this nicely brings us to the second part of the video that I'd introduced at the beginning, and it's where many people wonder what actually happens to coffee after it's been roasted and what the key variables are that affect its flavor. The main ones we focus on are those that negatively affect the coffee by accelerating the staling process. Things like temperature, humidity and moisture, oxygen is a big one, and exposure to sunlight. All of these things are generally traced back to how we store our coffee. The worse the storage is, the more we can expect these things to negatively affect the flavor. There is a lot we could talk about with fancy storage containers for coffee, but honestly, if you are keeping it in the original bag that the roaster gave you and keeping it away from unnecessary heat sources and from sunlight, you're going to be just fine. So how do we bring these points together? Well, on one hand, we do know that we want to let the beans rest and age for about 2 to 3 weeks because of the CO2 buildup. And on the other hand, we know that we need to store those beans under optimal conditions during this time, otherwise they will be negatively affected by the staling process. When we go back to the original question of can your coffee be too fresh? Well, the answer is yes, especially if we are focusing on this optimal zone. I'm sure we've all had coffees that tasted great just a few days after roasting. Even here at the roastery, we try coffees almost immediately after they're dropped, just to see how the coffee is doing. We learn to expect certain flavor characteristics that come from a fresh roast, and we look past them in order to do a quick assessment of quality. So what I want to be clear about is that just because your coffee is super fresh doesn't mean that it's going to be terrible until 2 or 3 weeks. It just means that your coffee might have optimal flavors, might taste the best at that time. Some of you may also be wondering at this point if coffee freshness matters more or less with different brewing methods. There's probably a longer video in my future where I could explore this topic in more depth, but for the time being, I will point out a few key differences between pour-overs and espresso. So at least for pour-overs, you can imagine that we've got a lot more control over the coffee. During the initial pour of water, often called the bloom, you will see a lot of carbon dioxide leaving the ground coffee as the water hits it and accelerates this this process. If your coffee was very fresh, just a few days off roast, you could consider letting it sit there for a while before adding your next batch of water. Let the gases leave for 45 seconds to a minute, and your next batch of water will have a better chance of extracting more flavors. However, in espresso, this is not as easy to achieve. We aren't using nearly as much water to begin with, and we don't have a lot of control. If the coffee is very fresh, you may not have a lot that you can do to stop the CO2 from negatively affecting the flavor. This could be one reason why a roaster will extend the recommended time for espresso beans up to 3 to 4 weeks after roast. And this is to ensure that enough CO2 has left your beans so that your small amount of water can do its best during the extraction. So I hope this has given you a decent idea as to why coffee freshness matters and why fresh is not always best. Please let me know in the comments if you have any further questions. I always love hearing from you guys, and I always try and respond to every question that I see. And again, it would also mean the world to me if you could like this video and subscribe. I will see you all again in the next video, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.